practices it too convenient for who refuse responsibility by saying, well, I'm not a tribal member, so I cannot do anything about it. Perpetuation of racism is one thing that enables racist oppression to continue under the guise of naturalness. Colonizers, falsified stories become universal truths. Cartoon caricatures distorts experiences and confounds the self-determination. Use phenotypical features as identities to remove the bearer from time and space. Those are the ultimate elements in the dehumanization process and in cultural genocide. Fundamental to any remedy are the processes of reintegration, remembrance, and revitalization of indigenous communities, only attainable through genuine self-determination. And we'll isolate 3 specific impacts. First is statistical genocide. Federally imposed blood quantum requirements are a form of settler colonialism that rely on the genocidal logics of elimination. Jackson in 20. Genocide and settler colonialism work on the logic of elimination by death, forced displacement, or assimilation in order to open land for new settlement. The socio-historical process by which racial identities are destroyed, created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. The indigenous people are measured by blood quantum. The still explicit federal to use the blood quantum is to liquidate tribal lands and eliminate true responsibility to tribes. Right? Indians would become indistinguishable. The last blood quantum was a critical tool of settler colonialism. Indigenous people need to appear in order to open up lands and resources for whites. And second is the state of exception. Blood politics accelerates racialization of indigeneity by subjecting native identities to the pseudoscience of Western thought. This serves to create arbitrary forms of exclusion between too native to be white and not native enough that confound the path to realizing traditional forms of determination, creating the logical foundation for racial genocide. Keel in 17. To understand blood quantum, one must ask why blood carries a symbolic value and effect is visually striking inside and outside the body, both routinely and in dramatic circumstances associated with life or life cessation. Blood can consecrate, purify, can also be profane and polluted, can divine community places the birth thereof. Why? Not saliva, sexual fluids, breast milk. Why should kinship be defined by fluid at all? The coupling of blood and nationalhood is by no means natural. Blood carries social meaning as a medium. Those roots are ancient in Western thought. Pure Christian blood emergence from anxiety about the contaminating effects of Jewish Muslim blood. Blood quantum standard was a product of colonial pseudoscience that joined ideas about biological substance with Victorian typology to social evolution. Racialization was a mechanism that could accelerate disappearance of indigenous people. Blood quantum figures as a scheme of authenticity that is policed by legal institutions, also by indigenous nations. Blood quantum undermines the authority of tribes like grant citizenship to individuals regardless of ancestry. Once fluid, open-ended concept being native became less bad and less flexible and became reliance by blood. Reliance on blood quantum results in arbitrary forms of exclusion. Blood quantum is doing exactly what it is intended to do, reinforce binaries. And third is immigrant violence. The pillars of racialization on which blood quantum is built create the conditions for violence against all other immigrant populations, wherein the West is an always already perfect society meant to cleanse the impurities that originate in populations they are receiving. The affirmative is a crucial first step in addressing the violence of the immigration system writ large. Cordaway in 17. Racialization, grouping people into categories based on perceived attributes. The social process that create these categories, race is a technology of order and governance. Process of racialization are about work and policy and discourse that see immigrant culture threatening these. Link understanding of religion, gender practices to group belonging categorization on the basis of a ground and transitive sense. Example, blood. The racialization enable exclusion from social, political, and economic forces, institutions, practices, part of boundary making processes that shape interpersonal interactions, institutional habits, and structural relations, discussing the inability of immigrants to fully participate in society. The racialization will homogenize those who cross territorial borders, having just arrived. With serious difference between those who settle, half settled, and those who are moving through it as later. Fails to acknowledge that many labeled immigrants are actually second and third generations. These prevent the analysis of differences. Western modernity renders liberation is something already achieved by majority society. Criminality, anti-Semitism, violence against women all become immigrant problems. And the one AC's focus on blood politics serves as a crucial vessel to explain the intangible identity of whiteness that allows for racialized property ownership. Through understanding laws like blood quantum and the one-drop rule, we create new forms of resistance outside of the conventional political parameters that allow racialized violence. Casey in 20. Race and politics in the United States are bound and inextricably to one another. One political realm with citizenship and U.S. legal actions to partial out who would receive full political privileges in these discourses. The issue of blood is around a rise statute like blood quantum. One drop rule will debated the legacy of racially contingent forms of property and property rights emerged from slavery and conquest and its foundation in the United States. The identity of whiteness became the basis of racialized privilege, colonizing the legal history of the basic of whiteness and property rights from the beginning of U.S. legislation. White occupation, possession of native land was validated. The basis for property rights there seems to trace the legacy of whiteness and property rights and consumption of native blood from the 19th century legislation. Federal and positional blood quantum for competitions of race and native nations continue reliance on them and perpetuates white property rights on native land. Blood quantum for the fortified native nations claims against claims of indigeneity from settlers that can concomitantly racialize the property relationship of native peoples and the land through blood requirement. And the affirmative advocacy for tribal determination is the only way for meaningful change to be made. One-size-fit-all policies inevitably fail, and any other strategy just reify the violence of racialization, patriarchy, and eugenics. Keel in 17. Blood quantum so thoroughly pyramided the ideas of race and citizenship that even the most common and alternative adheres to the same logic of figuring identity on descendants for sales indigenity's biological concept of indigeneity couples with the erasure of my matriarchal traditions and replacement with patriarchal structures. The broadening citizenship requirements beyond blood quantum would step towards reversing the attrition of indigenous nations. Nations must either racialize or risk losing recognition. This double bind leaves indigenous communities to exemplify authenticity. Not that they're making the scientific notion that race and purity even exists is a remnant from eugenics and white superiority. Blood quantum emerged from historically ground sense of parallel high stakes associated with blood quantum can make it a problem that cannot be approached with a one-size-fits-all solution. Is for each tribal community to navigate through native feel their land. And epistemology has been a goal of assimilation. People need not be biologically homogenous. People can become a nation when it exercises self-determination. And the state is inevitable. Denouncing us as liberal reformism ignores that even if we don't engage the state, it will engage us. Choate in 16. Reject engagement with the state to reinforce existing structures and relations of power. We disempower ourselves when we refuse to engage. Making demands that the state does not entail an endorsement. We are already involved in politics, already submitted to state oppression. The claim that we repudiate politics is that the state stops at the door of parliament. The question is not whether we engage with it, but how we do so. When government actors are explicitly endorsing the retreat of the state, attacks on state power have limited efficacy. I'm now open for cross-examination.
Okay. Ready, everyone?
Yes.
Ready.
Which of your authors are native?
Well, it depends on how you define native. For example, Ferguson was excluded from her tribe because she does not have proper blood quantum, but has native lineage and a large association with native. As Elizabeth Jackson is also native. I am not sure about Doug Keel or Korteweg. Or the Casey evidence. I know that Choate is not.
Yeah. You don't think it's like slightly problematic where it's possible that more than half of your evidence speaks for native populations instead of speaking with them?
We don't claim to speak for native populations, or we aren't. We say that native populations should be able to determine what they want.
Okay. And then I assume that you have evidence that indicates that this is what native populations want?
Yes, we have evidence that indicates that this is what they want. But even if they don't want to remove blood quantum, we still say the USFG shouldn't be able to determine who is and is not native.
Wait. So it's possible that native populations want this as a dictate of their sovereignty, but the USFG is going to get rid of it because, you know, the USFG gets to make these decisions?
No, the question is whether some indigenous nations want blood quantum as a means of determining who is and is not part of the tribe or part of the nation.
Okay, sure.
The USFG, we say, should not be able to determine who is or is not native on the northern border based on blood.
Okay, so basically just like anybody can immigrate who would claim native lineage? Is that what would happen?
Anybody politically affiliated with a tribe.
Okay.
So
Cool.
Tribes get to determine who is part of a tribe and who isn't. And those individuals.
Well, the plain text as worded says that you're removing this quantum requirement from the INA. Wouldn't that just remove the exception for native people to immigrate if you're not implementing a new requirement?
The INA says that individuals that are members of indigenous nations in Canada are free to pass as long as they have a 50% blood quantum requirement. So we remove the 50% blood quantum requirement, which means that indigenous individuals who are born in Canada have the ability for free passage.
Okay. Let's talk about the state inevitable argument.
Yeah.
Is the state the USFG?
Choate actually argues that just claiming the state is the USFG is problematic. We say that yes, the USFG is a large part of the state, but the way that academia and like life itself orients inevitably returns back to the state because state-based politics will always engage us.
Okay. Can you define engagement with the state? Does that mean we have to agree with it? We have to disagree with it?
Engagement with the state means that we have to use the state to do whatever it is we want to do. For example, the plan uses the state to deconstruct the colonialist notion of blood quantum that the state is currently using. And that's how we engage with the state.
Sure. Nothing further. I will take prep. Okay, stop prep. I have 137 used and I'll upload. Three off and then the case in order of proper and then framing. Okay. Everybody ready?
I'm almost gonna do one more thing.
And this is 7 minutes.
Correct.
Yes.
But if you want to talk for only like 5 or 6, I'm cool with that too.
Okay. I am ready.
Okay. Cool. First off, interpretation. At least half of authors or the speaker must be native, and any affirmative centered around native sovereignty. They violate cross-ex. Standards 1, echo chamber. They turn debate into an echo chamber for white academia. That's structurally violent because it focuses debate around people talking about natives rather than natives speaking for themselves. And 2, speaking for others. Speaking on behalf of the oppressed relegates them to more oppression. From Alcoff in 92. Where one speaks from puts the meaning and truth of what one says. Thus, one cannot transcend their location. A speaker's identity has an epistemic impact on that speaker's claims. Advocacy for the oppressed must be done by the oppressed themselves. Divergences in social location between speakers and spoken for will have a significant effect on what is said. And when oppressed voices are spoken for and excluded for dialogue, their identity changes to conform to the way they are represented. This is violent. Ryan 90. Representations take the place of things themselves. Images act on things they represent by transforming them to make them conform. Victims of violence are especially susceptible to this. Representations produced by violence come to be justifications for further violence. It's a voter. In-round discourse determines who can access debate, and since debate trains us as advocates, in-round discourse is going to structure the way that we think. You should drop the debater to punish and deter violence. If debaters lose on doing this, they'll stop doing it. Next is T. Interp. Restrictions is plural, so the F must increase more than one or remove more than one restriction. Tribes no date. Plural denotes a quantity greater than one. For example, 1 dog, 2 dogs, a noun forms its plural by adding s to its singular version. And they violate. They only remove one restriction. At best, they remove more restrictions effectually, which is an independent voter since topic arguments don't link to the plan text. Standards 1, grammar. The resolution is the only predictable stasis for debate, so grammatical interpretations are necessary to govern ground. Restrictions, plural, is one of the only objective terms in the resolution, so hold the line to limit the topic. And 2, ground. Counterclaim ground is the best non-racist net ground. The F doing multiple things gives the neg a better chance of being able to answer one of them on face without hating on minorities. Otherwise, debate becomes an echo chamber for privilege. And vote neg for reasons of fairness and education. An unfair game breaks down and an uneducational one is pointless. Prefer competing interps to set topic norms and because reasonability ensures judge intervention. Next is the critique. A. The settler colonial state uses borders to exert control. Borders keep out the racialized other while bringing in workers to bolster the state. Until we ask why settlers get to make the rules and write the story, immigration reform can never remedy injustice. Law professor Saito in 18. Assume the right to control who may, must, or may not enter the territory is a foundational precept of colonial founders, despite the master narrative that this is a nation of immigrants that erase indigenous sovereignty. It has been more accurately described as the white man's paradise. To maintain this paradise, immigration policies played a critical role. Many came voluntarily, believing in their ability to share in benefits accrued by the Euro-derivative settler class. Many others migrated from Chinese laborers, kidnapped and forced to migrate to Filipinos, driven from their homelands by U.S. colonial occupation to Central American refugees themselves, indigenous, forced off their lands by U.S. military governments. Government-facilitated importation of labor when the workforce was inadequate to territorial or economic expansion and then excluded these workers during economic downturn. Diversification of the population seems accepted grudgingly as the collateral damage of hegemony. B. Settler colonialism works through racial grammars, encoding genocide, white supremacy, and erasure of indigenous peoples. Colonialism is a structure that mediates everything else. Professors Tuck and Yang in 12. External colonialism denotes expropriation of indigenous worlds, animals, plants, and human beings, extracting them to build wealth of colonizers. Internal colonialism involves prisons, ghettos, minoritizing, schooling, and policing to assure ascendancy of a white elite. Indigenous peoples have been forcibly removed from their homelands onto reservations. The military still nicknames enemy territory Indian country. Settler colonialism is a structure and not an event for settlers. Indigenous peoples are in the way. Land is recast as property. Indigenous peoples must be erased. C. The alternative is to give back the land. Decolonization is not a metaphor and claims to solidarity or reconciliation just recreate settler moves to innocence. Professors Tuck and Yang in 12. Incommensurability on settler innocence. Reconciliation is about rescuing settler normalcy. Reconciliation is concerned with questions about what will decolonization look like? What will be the consequences for the settler? Incommensurability acknowledges that these questions need not be answered. Decolonization is not accountable to settler futurity. The answers are not in view and can't be as long as decolonization remains metaphor. It means removing conditional causes that punctuate decolonization and underrate settler innocence. Case. First term, the plan is a move to innocence. The settler state, not natives, still have the final decision-making power. From Whittinson in 19. Policies focused on process reveals colonial power dynamics. The settler state retains final decision-making authority. Assumption of legitimate settler state sovereignty underlies policy through which the settler state has definitional power and decision-making power. 2. The plan is a move to innocence. They let themselves center themselves as the good guys without engaging with their own complicity in being a settler. Professors Tuck and Yang in 12. Calling different groups colonized without describing their relationship to settler colonialism is an equivocation. Describing all struggles as decolonizing creates a convenient ambiguity between decolonization and social justice work, especially among groups minoritized by the settler nation state. Equivocation is a move toward innocence. Vogue and coalition politics among people of color, certain minorities can at times be quasi-assimilable, as exemplified by model minority discourse, yet in times of crisis revert to the status of foreign contagions. For many people of color, becoming a subordinate settler is an option, even if becoming white is not. And 3. The academy excludes non-white voices while claiming we're in a post-colonial world. That's messed up. You should question all of their epistemology. From Todd from the University of Aberdeen Social Anthropology in 16. The academy is colonial and elevates people who talk about indigenous people above people who speak with indigenous people as equals or are indigenous. European thought silences non-white voices, whereas the European academy tends to discuss the post-colonial. We are firmly still experiencing the colonial. let's talk specifically at the line by line. First, they have a plan flawed. Their plan removes the exception in the INA that allows people with 50% blood quantum to come into the U.S. without implementing a new restriction that would allow people who are associated with native tribes from coming into the U.S. If you just strike that from the INA, that means that there's no longer an exception for any natives to immigrate into the U.S. That's definitely actively worse. You should vote against them on plan flaws because, one, it encourages better plan writing, and two, you don't vote for policies that are written badly, even if they're well-intended. And they claim that we need to prioritize indigenous genocide in the state of exception. We have been in a state of exception since the foundation of the USFG. The USFG uses the state of exception to justify continual colonialism, both within its own borders and erasure of indigenous people, and outside its borders when it goes and colonizes other places under the guise of soft power hegemony. Claims of a state of exception mask the fact that that state of exception is predicated on violence against indigenous people. They have no way that they can possibly solve this as long as we are still occupying land that does not belong to us, as long as we are still destroying indigenous sovereignty, as long as we are still breaking the treaties that we made with these indigenous tribes, or forcibly made with these indigenous tribes. We've got to just get off the land if we want any hope of solving these issues. And let's talk about their framing. They say that we need to talk specifically about issues of blood. I argue that land is a prior question to issues of blood because if you look historically, land is the reason that these indigenous people were dispossessed. Land and things like manifest destiny, justifications for the USFG to go and commit genocide against all of these indigenous peoples. It was all about land. If we don't have borders, we can't possibly have a USFG, which means that governments need land to function. And they say tribal determination is good. We definitely agree. The tribe should have a right to self-determine outside of the scope of an illegitimate fake government premised on genocide. Then, they say that we have to engage with the state. The state is inevitable. First, we do engage with the state. We actively end the state. That is a method of engagement because it gives that power back to indigenous tribes. Second, they said in Cross-Ex that the state isn't just the USFG, it's also the ways that power is created through discourse. That means that we don't have to engage with the USFG to engage with the state. We can meet their interpretation while still rejecting the USFG. And third, this card comes from the White Academy, so it's probably questionable. And they have no justification for why the state has to exist or why the state we engage with has to be the USFG instead of indigenous bodies. I am ready for cross.
All right, let me get my timer set up. Starting on the native author procedural. You said that at least half of the authors have to be native. What does it mean to be native?
I would argue identify as native. People get to decide for themselves.
All right, and the negative is policing that to say they have to be, that the AF has to be at least 50% native to be considered native?
No. I argue that you should have at least 50% native authors so that you're speaking with indigenous people instead of for them. I'm not arguing that you have to become native. It's not an ontology question. It's just don't speak for others.
All right. Let's go to T restrictions. Where does the Shrives evidence define the word restriction?
Oh, it talks specifically about the pluralization of restriction. You can argue that restrictions is mass noun or something, but arguing that it's plural is probably one of the easiest to see things in the resolution.
Awesome. So we have to remove at least 2 different things of immigration policy?
Yeah.
All right. The alternative on the critique, you give back the land. How does that work?
It doesn't matter how it works. That's a claim of settler futurity. We have to give the power back to native leaders so that they can decide how it works because it's their sovereignty. Okay,
then let's use the past. The Supreme Court ruled that half of Oklahoma is indigenous land and yet nothing changed. How does the alternative differ?
We give back all of the land and all of the sovereignty. We get rid of the USFG. We delegitimize things like the Supreme Court that get to set borders for indigenous people.
Okay, so in the past, or before the Supreme Court decision, none of Oklahoma was determined indigenous land, or very little of it was. Why aren't all the white people getting thrown out of the eastern half of Oklahoma?
Because the USFG still has jurisdiction over Oklahoma. The fact that the Supreme Court had to rule that they get access to land that should have been theirs in the first place is messed up and problematic. Indigenous sovereignty can't occur until there's true sovereignty outside the guise of a genocidal government.
All right. The Todd evidence. It says that we are excluding non-white voices and claiming we're in a post-colonial world. Where did the 1AC claim that we're in a post-colonial world?
It more talks about how the Academy generally has a habit of doing that. So when we rely too much on the European Academy, we end up talking about things that are like, oh, we're post-colonial, when we're definitely not.
Okay, I can agree with you on that.
Yeah, great.
Let's go to the line-by-line argument that you make about why land necessarily outweighs blood. You say manifest destiny. So you're just like arguing that white property ownership is a prior question about violence against indigenous people? Is that the argument?
I'm arguing that that's the historical root of the violence, right? So even if we remove the blood quantum requirement, we're still on land. These immigrants who come into the U.S. would still have to follow U.S. laws, even though the land is stolen land. If we want to go back historically to what the root cause of this indigenous violence was, it is about the land.
All right. That's time. I'm going to start taking prep now. All right, stop prep 212 remaining, getting it uploaded now. The order is going to be case, the speaking for others procedural, or yeah, case, the speaking for others procedural, the T multiple arguments, and then the critique.
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
The case page, and then the speaking for others procedural, and then the other topicality violation about how we have to be multiple restrictions, and then finally the critique.
Thank you.
Is anybody not ready? Awesome. The USFG rejecting blood quantum has three unique impacts. The first is statistical genocide. Blood quantum as a means of membership guarantees that as tribal members have children with non-native peoples, that tribal numbers and cultures dwindle down to nothingness. That's Jackson. Second is the state of exception. Blood quantum creates a violent state between two native to get the benefits of being white, but not native enough to belong to a tribe. Blood works as a way for Western scientists to explain how black and brown bodies contaminate pure white blood. That's the Keel evidence. And third is broader immigrant violence. The systems of racialization that the idea of blood reproduces is the basis for violence against all other immigrant populations. It allows the U.S. to draw the line between the good U.S. citizen and the harmful immigrant because of something fundamentally different in their genetics. This allows all problems to be seen as immigrant problems instead of realizing the violence perpetrated by the state. Onto the line by line. The first argument is that we're removed to innocence because the state still has power. We say we are a step in the right direction, that we increase tribal determinism. This is an argument that goes drop. The state doesn't ultimately decide who can and can't be native. We leave it up to tribes. The next argument is that we are complacency, but the cross-apply and extend the Ferguson evidence that the SQO is necessarily complacency in this argument, that currently people are complacent with ongoing genocide because they say it's not my place to talk about it. The argument is that in discursive spaces, everybody needs to address the violent impact of blood quantum in order to actually see material change. The next argument they say is that Academy excludes the Academy excludes and claims we're post-colonial. One, the AF never claimed we were post-colonial, but secondly, cross-apply the Keel piece of evidence from the bottom of the case page that talks about how native epistemologies are actively stripped in the status quo. Only reversing the idea of what is and is not native based on the racialization of blood is able to solve the epistemological questions that they talk about. The next argument they say is plant flaw, but not true. The INA already says that persons born in Canada can have free passage, or indigenous persons born in Canada can already have free passage. We just removes the requirement says as long as they have 50% blood quantum. So everybody with a tribal membership can go for it. This is a ridiculous argument. Next, cross-examination checks. Next, they say state of exception impacts are not inevitable because of the state. One, we say the state's inevitable, but I'm going to do that on the K. Yes, and then secondly, we're going to answer that blood is key, but that'll be on the critique. The next argument they say is that the land is prerequisite to blood, but no, cross-apply and extend the Casey piece of evidence that blood is gives a broader understanding of why white property ownership is a thing. Things like the one-drop rule that determining that black people are black if they have one drop of African-American blood and therefore not allowed to have rights, or the fact that indigenous people, that you have to be at least half indigenous to receive benefits from the state is an example of the way that white folks use racialization as a means to shift the goalposts to increase their land ownership and other property ownership. Means we explain land better. And I'll answer everything else there on the critique. Go to T plural. Interpretation, we only have to remove one restriction there, we only have to remove one restriction. The first reason to prefer is resolutional burden. The resolution exists as a larger cohesion of AFs. The resolution is an example of multiple AFs put together. If we just do something within the resolution, then that means we're topical. We're not hypo-testing here, Sarah. Come on. The next argument we're going to say is it excludes core AFs, like just removing the per country caps on EB visas. Next, they don't isolate any ground loss or any limits arguments in this round. You should evaluate this based on proven abuse, and you should default to reasonability. If we provide a reasonable interpretation for debate, you should not reject us. And reading the topicality shell straight turns their fairness and education impacts. Reject the team. We're going to go for the one drop rule. Extend Keel. Their topicality argument is just like the one drop rule, including even one affirmative that doesn't meet their idea of what a topical AF should be, makes the entire topic unredeemable. These are the same logics that allow for the racialized violence of exclusion that are forced upon indigenous folks. You should probably reject the team. Go to the speaking for others argument. Interpretation, and anybody can read a critique, anybody can focus on native sovereignty as long as the 1AC addresses blood politics. Cross-apply Ferguson, we necessarily need to address blood politics in order to decrease the violence that blood quantum creates on indigenous folks. It's uniquely key. And secondly, the identity checking disadvantage, the negative interpretation necessitates that the judges arbiter who is and is not native, which is really fucked up. The third argument is that they don't have any notion of what sovereignty necessarily is here. Like, how much does the AF have to do to be about tribal sovereignty? This is a ridiculous argument, and is the 50% blood quantum restriction? I don't know how else to argue this. Go to the K. Framework, interpretation. You should weigh implementation of the AF in political spaces against actualization of an alternative. Prefer our interpretation for fairness and education. Any other interpretation moots 6 minutes of 1AC offense, decrease incentive to cut new affirmatives, or even read a 1AC in the first place. And the state is inevitable. Extend choke from the 1AC. It will always engage with us. It is not just the government in Congress, but the everyday way we orient ourselves in everyday life. The only way we can make meaningful change that doesn't see the political to the right is to advocate real live state-based solutions. And we win under any other interp. Discussions of blood are uniquely key to understand settler colonial violence. Extend Ferguson. Discursive rejection of blood quantum has unique representational benefits. And go to the K proper. Cross-apply the AF. It's a disadvantage to the all. Only the 1AC's removal of blood racialization can solve the impacts of genocide, state of exception, and immigrant violence. That was on the case page. And there's no link. We're negative state action. We just say tribal determinism is good. We don't say the USFG should stick its nose anywhere else. And we turn the AF. The 1AC is an example of giving back the land. We give free passage rights, which is more land than the natives had before. And permutation. Remove blood quantum from the INA and give back the land. And that should solve all their arguments. And they can't solve the AF. Two reasons. One, doesn't address the question of blood and determining who is and isn't native. The USFG gives the land back to the wrong people in the world of the counterplay, in the world of critique. Second, they can't solve broader questions of racialization, U.S. immigration law. Only 1AC's focus on phenotypical conceptions of blood can address the way Western thought constructs immigrant problems and racialization. The third impact is a disadvantage to the alt. And reject any links of omission. I can't address every fucked up thing the USFG has done to native folks in the 1AC. We are in the direction of the critiques. You should probably vote on the permutation. And I made the Oklahoma argument in cross-ex. like no land was given back, even though it was ruled that it was indigenous land, proves that the alternative fails. And no link, I made that argument. And plan is key to determine who deserves the land based on the process of removing blood quantum, which means permutation, do the plan, and then the alternative. And there's a racism DA. They don't address larger structures of blood as it determines white property ownership. Even if we give back the land, residual impacts of blood, like the one drop rule, keep the violence against black people as it relates to property ownership. White people might get home, but non-white folks will still be considered polluting. That's the KCP's of evidence. When the fact that the alternative does not address blood means that the net benefit to voting on the permutation is the white property ownership as well as the racialization advantage.
I'll take the rest of my prep. I have 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Okay, it's going to be an overview, and then the speaking for others procedural, topicality, and then critique and case.
Could you do the order one more time?
Overview, speaking for others procedural, topicality, critique, case.
Cool, thank you.
Everybody ready?
Yes.
They mishandled the speaking for others procedural. It's an in-round impact. Speaking for natives is really bad. And also, like, they should have access to determine their own sovereignty, which requires determining their own scholarship. This is an ontology impact. They have conceded that speaking for others fundamentally shifts native ontology toward the oppressor. This is an in-round discursive impact, which means they don't get to weigh the affirmative or their blood arguments against this procedural. It's fundamentally mishandled and a prior question. So let's start on the line by line with procedural. They should have at least half authors that identify as native, because to do anything else tokenizes indigenous voices within the academy. You can point to your one indigenous author and say, oh, look, I have somebody speaking for them. That's equivalent to saying, oh, yeah, I have one black friend, so I'm not a racist. Any alternative to having at least half indigenous authors necessitates that the white academy is going to be speaking for indigenous people rather than allowing indigenous people to speak for themselves. There are two impacts, and neither of them are correctly handled. The first is it makes debate an echo chamber for privilege. It allows the academy to determine the epistemology that we understand, which is really weird in an AF that's predicated on indigenous genocide. Even if their scholarship says the quote-unquote right things, the fact that that scholarship comes from the European Academy means that it prioritizes scholarship from that academy over other indigenous indigenous forms of scholarship, which means it fundamentally double turns itself. It creates the same kind of exclusion that it seeks to address. That's an a priori in-round impact. I'll explain why that comes before any fiated arguments. And second, they conceded that speaking for others fundamentally changes the ontology of those others that are being spoken for. They begin to perform their identity in a manner consistent with the oppressive regime because that becomes the only way to survive in that regime. That's the evidence on the second argument here. Speaking for others is fundamentally bad. My interpretation provides two ways out. They can either they can either cite more than half Native authors to ensure that Native authors are given a real voice rather than just a token one, or they can be Native themselves so that they can speak for people with an identity that they identify with. Their responses. They say that it's bad for the judge to have to identify who is Native and who is not. We address this in cross-ex. If somebody identifies as Native, we'll count them as Native. This is a sovereignty question. People should get to determine their own ontology. Literally, that seems like basically true. People should get to determine their own ontology. That is the thesis of this argument. People should get to determine their own ontology. An oppressive regime should not speak for them. Doing so is inherently oppressive, double turns the case, and is an independent reason to vote against them. Then, they say that we don't have any specific idea of indigenous sovereignty. My argument is beyond that. My argument talks about indigenous self-representation within the academy. To do otherwise would tokenize indigenous people. I don't really understand how this argument applies here because the relation of indigenous sovereignty in this debate is predicated on the idea that indigenous people should be able to represent themselves. And it's a voting issue. They conceded that this is a drop the debater issue in the last speech. It is way too late for them to argue that anything from case necessarily can cross-apply. They needed to do that implications in the last speech because they don't address the warrants that dropping the debater deters and punishes this kind of abuse. If you drop the debater for speaking for others, one, it deters people doing that kind of violent epistemology in the debate space. It means that when people want to read Native apps, they'll actively go and seek out Native authors. That's much better for scholarship. And two, it punishes them for doing this in the round. It's like a discursive act of violence and really should not be happening in this debate. Okay. They're probably going to stand up and tell you that they might have at least half Native authors they don't even know from the AC. If they don't even know, that's also problematic because they don't know if they want indigenous people to speak for themselves or if they want other people to speak for them. Then, they're probably going to try to weigh the case against this and claim that blood outweighs this form of sovereignty. That's not true. Sovereignty is about somebody's ontology. The reasons that they have for why blood is problematic is that it shifts the conception of who gets to be in a Native group and who doesn't. But in-round discourse necessarily comes first because it's a fiated question. It's a question of who has a space in debate, who gets to access debate. We can't have any access to any affirmative if people can't first access debate. They'll claim that they get to weigh the app for fairness reasons, but fairness reasons don't occur when people don't have access to a space that represents their own forms of scholarship. That just legitimizes oppression in the space. Also, it justifies serial policy failure because if we don't allow indigenous peoples to speak for themselves, then removing the blood quantum requirement, even if it's net positive in the status quo, is just going to mask forms of oppression because the next time natives say, hey, you're oppressing us, they can say, well, we removed this requirement, so look, we're the good guys. That's the move to innocence argument from the critique, and they did not handle it in the context of this procedural. And okay, let's go to the T-flow and engage with the line by line there. They say that topicality is an independent voting issue. Topicality is a jurisdictional issue, a question of what we can engage with in the debate space. We have to engage with scholarship in its original form, but we also can't engage with every piece of scholarship in the world, which means that there should be limits on the kinds of scholarship that we engage in. That's how we would make the debate space educational. If we don't have any limits, that's like means that we can't engage with anything in debate. They say it's the one drop rule. We make the whole topic seem irredeemable. That's not true. We're arguing that this app specifically is outside the scope of the topic, which is a fundamentally different argument. And it's also really different because the one drop rule was put on a population that didn't consent. But when we debate, we tacitly consent to debate the resolution, to debate the rules. You can leave debate without negative consequences, but if you're brought over as a slave and are forced to go through this one drop rule, you probably can't escape. That's like actually a pretty problematic comparison. Okay. Critique flow. We're going to kick the alt. They didn't ask if it's conditional. That means none of their so-called offense here, that means none of their claimed offense here is going to apply. The only offense that they're going to be able to access is the offense that links specifically to the procedural, which we addressed on the procedural flow. That means that none of their perms or anything are going to matter. Vote negative.
All right, I'm going to take some prep time if I can find where I wrote down how much I have. I think I've got 2 minutes. That's what I have written down here. Starting now. All right, the order is going to be the K, the topicality argument, the K, the topicality argument, and then the case and the procedural, speaking for others procedural, are going to kind of be together. I'll do most of the casework on the speaking for others procedural.
Could you do the order one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the critique, the topicality arguments, and then the speaking for others procedural. And I'll do some cross application of case cards on speaking for others, but I'll make it as clear as I can.
Okay. I'm ready.
Awesome. On the critique, extend the no link that we are negative state action. Don't evaluate any of their links or impacts to the post-fiat implications of the affirmative. This just comes down to a question of the speaking for others procedural. On topicality, we're not going to go for this one drop rule disadvantage. They don't tie an impact to it. But more importantly, they conceded that they conceded the counterinterpretation in the standards, which means that just the debate really just comes down to the question of the speaking for others procedural. Now, there are a few arguments I'm going to go for here. The first is extend the interpretation that goes dropped, that we must mean the negative interpretation unless the 1AC is specifically talking about issues of blood and blood colonialism. Now, the net benefit to that is the Ferguson piece of evidence. Cross-apply it here. The Ferguson evidence says that regardless of whether an individual identifies with a tribe or not, we all need to fight against instances of blood in discursive spaces. It specifically talks about how when we engage in discussions and debate about blood quantum and its legitimization as white people get to determine who is and is not native, that deconstructs the binaries that allow that deconstructs the idea of racialization that allows blood quantum to exist at the federal level. That means, yes, we get to weigh the AF against this. Just because they entirely drop this discursive impact that was cross-applied in the 1AR. Go back and read the Ferguson card. It's pretty good on the fact that we all need to address this regardless of the speaking for others. Also, the conceded counterinterpretation subsumes almost all of their ontology offense. We would say blood is a unique impact that that everybody needs to talk about, and that they don't have any reasons why specifically talking about blood is harmful to these people. Next, extend the third argument I made that Sarah says didn't really make a point. The point here is that they have no definition of what is nation sovereignty. What a 1AC addresses native sovereignty is. That means there's no bright line. This serves as terminal defense against this. If we just mention indigenous folks, is that enough for us to link to this interpretation? It doesn't. The lack of a bright line means that you should not vote negative on this because it encourages arbitrary debates that always rush to ontology first instead of evaluating the flow of the debate and making it impossible for affirmatives to ever win because they'll just go go for the link on the set called K and then say that talking about immigration is itself speaking for others. Finally, we're going to go for that this argument is necessarily identity checking. They say that as long as somebody identifies as Native, that we'll allow it. What's to stop white people from saying, well, I identify as Native, so therefore we get to read the affirmative. We would say that the only viable form of identity checking is one that occurs at the tribal level, which is what the plan advocates for. We say that nobody else should be able to tell tribes who is and is not part of an indigenous group, which means that if you buy the argument that the idea of blood quantum increases racialization of indigenous folks and creates real discursive violence against them, then you should vote affirmative in this debate. Ultimately, yes, ultimately, Sarah did not engage with the counterinterpretation above, nor did she engage with the Ferguson discourse arguments, which necessarily take out all of the arguments she makes about ontology and speaking for others coming first. Good debate, Sarah.
Good round.